Greetings, my Graveling Growls. It is Mansant back at you again with now my brand new signature sleeves. Now today's video is ripe for the season. We've got Skirmish season upon us, which means of course everyone is clamoring for the best Blitz deck, the deck that will give them the best odds at winning and hopefully some fun along the way. And I'll tell you what, Levia is for sure the hero that will get you some fun games. Now this build is still experimental, but as opposed to my last video where I said I wasn't really enjoying Levia in Blitz, she had a lot of high variance game states that could just leave you a lot of fields bad moments. Well, this build actually minimizes a lot of that, and I've been loving it and having some pretty good success in testing as well. But credit where credit's due. I've been talking a lot with Levia players on the Discord to get some ideas about alternative playstyles to Levia that aren't so just go aggro, and then of course our boy Yazi as well got back to me about some of the ways he's been playing this hero. And so I combined some things, what I like, what other people were talking about, and I think I've come across a very unique Levia deck that hopefully all of you will enjoy. So first things first, of course, we're running the young Levia here. Absolutely love this art. Still waiting for my cold foil copy though. The weapon of choice are going to be the mandible claws, only the mandible claws. Actually found that even versus Wizard, the way you win that game is through a powerful Bloodrush, so there's really no need to run anything else. You don't even need the Ravenous Meat Axe to fill grave in that matchup. So we're just going to run the Mandible Claws. And then as far as equipment, this is going to be the stock standard in as many games as we can hope to run it. Scabskins, Gambler's Gloves, Carrion Husk, Hope Merchant's Hood. However, versus some of the more on-hit heavy decks, you will have to run Skullcap instead. So this is going to be stuff like Ira that's threatening the mass trigger. Dorinthia is kind of up to the player, how confident you feel in it. I personally still go Hope Merchants, but you can go Arc Knight in that matchup as well. Briar, you're going to want the Arc Knight, for example. But this suite of equipment, what it's really letting you do is just be a tank. It lets you use your life as a resource because you have just so much more health over your opponents that you can use your equipment to block and keep big hands to set up more pivot turns than the average player, especially when you compare it to a deck like, let's say, Ira or any of the Rangers. Their ability to use equipment for pivot turns is very limited, where with the equipment you're running here, you actually can do this twice, if not 3 times over, with Carrion Husk, 3 block on Skullcap, 3 block on Scabskins. Of course, you run the Gambler's Gloves as well, because in those scenarios where you're rolling Scabskins, Gamblers is just that hopeful assurance from rolling a 1 and kind of ending your turn and taking blood debt. And I will say my mentality in this build for when you roll Scabskins is a bit different. Previously in Classic Constructed, I'd only really roll Scabskins if the damage differential was about 6 that turn. So if I could roll Scabskins and, you know, weave in a Deep-Rooted Evil or get in another Boneyard Marauder, whatever it was, I would risk rolling Scabskins because 6 damage is a threat of basically 2 card equivalents on your opponent to block it out. And that's a big enough advantage to risk it. In Blitz, though, I really tend to roll Scabskins on a damage differential of 4 or more. So I would never roll Scabskins just to try to weave in a Mandible Claw attack. However, this build is running Ghostly Visit, and if you could ever have that floating resource to go to a Ghostly Visit, 4 damage is a big deal in Blitz. It threatens a lot of health, potentially 1 or 2 cards. So I will roll Scabskins a lot more in this build, I'd say, than I would in Classic Constructed, because anytime you can get a Ghostly Visit, it's a lot of pressure. That said, you're rolling it more often, but the games are shorter, so it actually is probably kind of balanced out. And then for Wizard in particular, this is pretty unique, and this is a lot of credit to Yazi on this one, who plays against a lot of very, very strong Kano players out there in the land down under. So versus Wizard, you can see it's actually a pretty different take than what I was recommending before. Previously, I thought Hose of the Shadow Beast, Barkbone Strapping was powerful enough to give you those really threatening turns against Wizard. But it turns out that Levia, we gotta lean into that best card in her deck, you know, the old trusty Bloodrush Bellows. And Bloodrush Bellows presents more damage than Kano's entire life pool just on your basically low end, which is 18 damage on those turns. So really what that means is against Kano, you just need equipment that lets you survive to that point. If you can get off your Bloodrush, you've basically stolen the game out from under them because you're buying yourself 2 turns back to back because they either block it or take it and you probably should have game sometime along those lines. So really what this equipment set is doing then is providing Null Rune 3 with the Skull Horn and Null Rune gloves. So whenever you can afford to pitch a blue, you're going to be pitching a blue into these to soak 3 arcane damage. But then Kano, as we know, has a lot of on-hit effects, sitting in that 4 to 5 range that he absolutely loves. So whenever he's going to try to hit you for some big opt damage, I believe it's Aether Spindle, and it's coming in for 4 or something like that, you can, in those situations, kind of read the board state. Is it this pivotal turn where an opt is really going to set him up for next turn? If so, this may be a point to crack a Spell Void equipment and prevent that 4, along with pitching to the Null Rune. And then the other beauty of it is that these are going to go to grave. So out of nowhere, you can just stock your graveyard as long as you have 1 card in there, which you will have from at least something else that goes there, Ghostly Visit or some of the other cards I'll show you. So really, these cards are absolutely critical in beating the Kano matchup, and it tends to be a very fast game. So even though these only block for 1, that's a huge value in a game that's probably only lasting like 3 turns. So with that, that's going to be the equipment suite and a brief explanation of the deck, and then we're going to switch over to the full deck. All right. Hopefully this isn't too much on the screen here, but I think in a Blitz deck, there's actually very good reason to kind of go through every single card in the deck and clearly explain why it's there. When you're working in building decks in Blitz, right, you only have 40 cards available to you, and you can't sideboard these cards. So you have to be very careful about every card in your deck because it's going to be there across every single matchup available. And in Blitz, there's a lot of very different kind of decks that are quite good. You've got decks like Oldhim, which are very slow controlling. You've got Kano, who's, of course, this arcane damage fiend. You've got Dorinthia, who's weapon-based and wanting you to block tall. You've got Ira, who's going wide and can get you into late-game lock situations. And then Briar, who's just this crazy aggro nightmare. So in kind of thinking about the meta, you need to make sure that every card in your deck has some play across everything. And if it doesn't, it needs to be good enough to still make the cut for every other matchup that's out there. So this deck list has been fine-tuned to do exactly that, while still playing towards what Levia wants to do. And I think that balance was very tricky. So bear with me, this might be a longer video, but we're going to go through each card here, and I'm going to tell you why it's here and what you want to do with these things. So first things first, we'll start at the top. Up here, we've got mostly a lineup of reds. Really, with this deck, what you want to look at in terms of everything that's on screen here is that this deck is built around a 2-card hand game plan. Levia already has very good 2-card hands, exemplified by Endless Maw, right? A 3 cost, so off 1 blue, you can play it for 9 damage. That's one of the best cards Levia has, and so you want to maximize more versions of cards like this, because unfortunately we only have the one that's really playable as a red. So the other things that this build is chasing to do is go and find more of these 2-card hands that are very threatening, that demand interaction with your opponent, either through forcing them to block or from pushing lots of damage just off 2 cards. So a perfect example of this is something like Barraging Beatdown, which is a card that Reinar's been using to great success, right? This card, even in conjunction with something like your Mandible Claw, which is just a very cheap 2-cost weapon that's swinging for 3, when you have a 2-card hand available to you of yellow or blue pitch and a Barraging Beatdown, all of a sudden you are threatening 7 off 2 cards, only truly expending 1 card, right? Because the Barraging is the card you're playing, the other card's going to go back into your deck. You're threatening 7 damage off 2 cards, and a very awkward choice for your opponent, because if they block with 2 cards on your base 3 attack weapon, that is very inefficient for them. So that's the kind of play that tends to just start winning you the game if your opponent lets these things through. It barely costs you anything to push this through, and if they start blocking 2 cards on your weapon swing, they're losing lots of value and you're gaining lots of value. So this is another very good card with that in mind. 2-card hands, right? Another great 2-card hand is going to be the Red Dread Screamer with a Ghostly Visit and Banish. Similarly, Hungering Slaughterbeast with Ghostly Visit and Banish, you will have to roll the die for that one, but at least it's there. What these cards are doing in conjunction is that same idea of, with 1 blue in hand and then 1 of your good attacks, present as much damage possible. So of course a Red Dread Screamer with a blue and a Ghostly and Banish is going to be 10 damage. A Hungering with Ghostly and Banish and a blue and the Scabskins roll is 11 damage. These are crazy good rates for only 2 cards, which truly like no other class in the game, no other deck in the game can really match those numbers. If you think about what Briar is going to do off a 2-card hand, right? This is this crazy meta threat deck. Off a 2-card hand, she's going to be presenting probably 8 damage, right? Just 8. And it's across 2 breakpoints, which if you have a lot of defense reactions, you can block out pretty easily. But now all of a sudden you've got what Levia can do off 2-card hands, and you can see kind of the value in what's going on here. Another amazing 2-card hand, which I know it doesn't block, but I'll get to that in a second, is going to be the red Deadwood Rumbler. So Deadwood Rumbler, same thing. 3 cost, so just 1 blue card, to swing for 8. And yes, it does not block, but once again, it's falling in line with all these crazy good 2-card hand breakpoints we've got. We've got 7 with barraging. We've got 7 alone with the Hungering Slaughter Beast, potentially 11. We've got 9. We've got 10 with this. We've got 8 here. Those are just all above the curve damage breakpoints. So the thing to note, I guess we'll move on to this, with the no block, right, is that once we look at the second line of my deck here, you'll notice there's a defensive package which hasn't really been seen in too many Levia builds. And that is going to be the 2 Sigil of Solace, 2 Sink Below, and 1 Fate Foreseen. So with these non-blocks that Levia runs, normally you want to minimize the amount you have to run, right? You're thinking, okay, I only want to run, the Doomsday because it's really good for my deck. It's a non-block. I only want to run the blue Deadwoods because it's a blue 6. And the fact that it non-blocks, doesn't really matter. I'm going to pitch it. Well, now you start running more of the aggressive non-block package with the Deadwoods, but stuff like Sink Below is going to help shore up that clunkiness that can happen when you have too many non-blocks in your hand. Because all of a sudden, sinking a card can allow you to bottom that non-block, find something else that will block. Sigil of Solace, another amazing card in Blitz in particular, because 3 health is just a massive percentage of your life. What this card can also do in Levia in particular is basically bank you health for later. When you play a slower game, early game, and you see these kinds of cards, that kind of goes in line with how Levia wants to play the game anyway. You're building up to be a late game kind of onslaught powerhouse, and Sigil is going to do that for you. Heal 3 in the early game, fill your grave a bit, and then let you have these momentous turns later in the game because this card bought you some value when you saw it early. We've got the Fate Foreseen as well, just a 1 of here because, there are some odd counts when you start building Levia decks because of the Eye and Soul Harvest, Doomsday, that kind of thing. The Fate Foreseen with the Opt 1 can do some cool things with the Deadwood Draw Discard effect. And yeah, so that's your defensive package. And the other cool thing to note about this is that the 2 Sinks and the Fate are really good into unsuspecting Ira players because Ira has this strategy against Shadow Heroes, like against Chain and I guess Levia, that they actually want to run Zephyr because they assume that you're not running defense reactions. So if they run Zephyr, it basically demands that you block with Husk immediately because that's the only way in your deck to break it. But you are running defense reactions, so that can kind of punish them if they do that. And not every Ira player is going to do that, but if they do, then boom, you've already got this main board answer to that and can really abuse them. The defense reacts are also really good into like the Bravo matchup, into Dorinthia, even into Oldhim, because this is going to full block their Winter's Wail. So they actually end up being pretty good across the board. You don't want to run too many though because of stuff like Kano. So running the 3 count is kind of that perfect middle ground. You don't want to go too heavy on the Fate Foreseens because they're reds and obviously can interrupt how you want to pitch into Kano and all that. But that said, at 3, even against Kano, sometimes if you can, maybe just Arsenal 1 to get around their Nourishing Emptiness play if they go for that. And so the Sigil as well, I'll just mention this here. So the other beautiful thing about stuff like the 0 cost and the instants, like Sigil, Barraging Beatdown, the reds and the blues, is that in Levia, if you are at like 2 cards in graveyard, but you want to make a big play with one of these and need those 3 in grave, these instant playables are really, really hard for your opponent to interact with because they might be making decisions based off the fact that, oh, if I just don't attack them this turn, they can't pull off an attack. But then, boom, they pass over into you, and you just Sigil, fill grave. Barraging Beatdown, fill grave. And that just feels awesome. So those have been absolutely critical in Blitz because you don't want to ever miss those turns of pressure. Whereas in Classic Constructed, you can kind of just take an extra turn and set up, swing a bit with weapon. But in Blitz, if your opponent is ever passing into you, in an assumption that you can't play something big because of your graveyard, you need plays to fill up your grave instantly. And normally you have Hope Merchants, which can help do that, but you can't run it in every matchup because of how good Skullcap is. So that's just a side note on the sigils and barragings. I know this is kind of all over the place. Then we'll keep going over here. So Beast Within and Bloodrush, obviously beautiful combo there. Beast Within also fantastic in some of those ice matchups and versus Bravo, because you can discard it and refill your hand still. So it's just a card you never really want to cut. It's just great. Blocks 3, it's a 6. You can even play it early game if you want. Bloodrush, best card in the deck. This build of Levia is actually kind of as Bloodrush centric as you can be, honestly, because the whole playstyle you're going to start to chase, I guess, is this idea of when you use Sync, when you use Fate for Scenes, if it's not a Bloodrush, put it on the bottom. Dig a bit to find your first Bloodrush to really push your tempo game forward. Find your second one to end the game. That's kind of what you're going to be doing with this build. Going into these Bloodrush turns, the most critical piece is to have one of these cards arsenal. Anything that turns off your Blood Debt and has a brute attack, right? So the Dread Screamer, fantastic. Deadwood Boneyard, absolutely the best one for that. Hungering Slaughter Beast is pretty good, so is Endless Maw. You really want to have one of those in arsenal going into your Bloodrush turns, because in Blitz, even if you can't get the perfect claw, like Boneyard turn off, something like that, even, going Claw into Endless Maw for 11 in Blitz is fantastic pressure. So Bloodrush, fantastic card, as we all know. Art of War, I'd thought about cutting this card for a while, but actually it is just so good. Like, you really just can't cut it, because what it's going to do, once again, is allow you to fill Grave just on a whim. You can play it, cycle some cards, it's going to go to Grave. That can help you get your plays going. You can even play it very early game to kind of do that same thing I'm talking about, where if your hand doesn't have a Bloodrush, just start drawing towards it and getting your setup. So I don't super recommend it, but it can come up where you're going first. You can kind of just Art of War to start clearing cards, as long as whatever you banished didn't have Blood Debt, just to dig closer to the big Bloodrush Bellow. Because the one thing about Art of War in this build is that you'll notice there's no Graveling Growl. And that's because Graveling Growl is not a 2-card hand card. That card requires a lot more setup. It needs to be an arsenal, or the Dread Screamer needs to be an arsenal for it to be a really good play. And that's off 3 cards, right? The Graveling, the Dread Screamer, the blue. In Blitz, you really don't want to have too many cards that are based around 3 specific card synergies, because you don't really get to make the choices of, oh, I'm just going to keep this hand. You need to be very reactive with what your opponent's doing. So that's the main reason I cut Gravelings from this build, especially since the pressure of Ghostly again and again is honestly just fine. Yes, it's 3 less damage, but the fact that this is playable from Banish is just fantastic. So the Art of War, what it's really going to do, like I said, is cycles cards. It's going to banish Ghostly, give things go again. And you can end up still having these really fun sequences of like Art of War, banish a Ghostly Visit, go again. Ghostly Visit comes in with go again from banish into, closing the combat chain. Dread Screamer clears it out. Dread Screamer gains go again into Ghostly Visit again. I mean, it's just a card that enables a lot of these plays for Levia, so you definitely keep it in. And even though it's a non-block, right, it's what I was talking about with the Sync Blows. So just, yeah, very good. You also notice that the only yellows we run are these 3 Majestics, and that's because yellows aren't a great breakpoint for Levia. Yellow's not really paying for anything you want. It's only paying for, like, a weapon in particular, right? Your claws are going to swing for at a cost of 2, but you don't really want to be swinging claws with this build. This build is keen on going more defensive, not even worrying about swinging claws until you've got these 2-card power cards, 2-card power turns set up, which can be very quickly because of stuff like the Deadwood Rumbler, right? You don't actually need your graveyard set up to go for this one. So if you see things in a perfect sequence, the deck just runs fantastic. So yeah, not too keen on running that many yellows. Then we go to the bottom here with the blues. So this is a very blue-heavy deck, which is actually amazing because it works in with how Levia wants to pay for things anyway, and is really good for your Kano matchup. And the blues that you get to run are really all super good. I'd love for like another blue 6 in here or something like that, but all these blues actually have a very specific purpose. They're not just pitch fodder. Number 1, the Blue Dread Screamer. This is a card that you're going to want to pitch early game, but the beauty of it is that when it comes back around in second cycle, if you get to that point, it still turns off Blood Debt, it still goes go again, still has go again, and it's going to be a very weird breakpoint for those control decks. So this is just mainly a second cycle card. Very good. You've got the blue Deadwood Rumblers, which as a 6 blue is fantastic because, you know, if you banish it on Art of War, if it gets discarded somehow, or you discard it with Bloodrush, you know, it's giving you those synergies. Plus it's mildly playable off the fact that, yeah, it's another 2-card hand type play, not for fantastic damage, but you can do it. This card, if you pitch it early game, you know, it has all those same synergies when it comes back around in the second cycle. And if you do pitch this early game, make sure that you track it a bit so that you know what's on top of your deck when you see this in second cycle, just in case you have to go with the draw discard on Deadwood. So one thing to note. All right, sorry about that. My phone died. I believe last thing we were talking about was Deadwood Rumbler, so continuing on then. All right, so next card here is going to be Blue Barraging Beatdown. And this card is one of the better ones to actually play early game, unlike a lot of the other blues. But that's only because it falls in line with what those other instantly playable cards do, right? It just fills up the grave, and then it gives your opponent some incentive to actually block things out, which you want them to do, because when they block with 2 cards, right? And then when you block with 2 cards, your 2-card hands are more powerful than theirs. So that's all that same theme of what this deck wants to do. The other beautiful thing is that when you pitch this card, you can actually set up some end game, just instant win combos. If you know that you pitch 2 blue Barraging Beatdowns back to back, which can happen, you can end up with the third one stacked in as well, a red one, with either Ophidia or like the Fate for Scenes or the Sink Belows, something like that, to just know that late game you've got a triple Intimidate hand coming up. And even though you're not Rhinar, a triple Intimidate on Barraging Beatdown means they pretty much can't turn off all those additive damage bonuses. So that can be a really fun thing that comes up, but you don't want to force that, it just might happen. Of course, it still blocks 3, and then Intimidate as well. Not a keyword I really touched on earlier, but you know, it is adding some funkiness to what your opponent wants to do with their hand. And that's always fun, you know, give some stress to your opponent, why not? Because we already face so much as Levia players. Then with the Convulsions from the Bellows of Hell, this card is one of the best ones to end up in your deck for second cycle, because the Dominate and the +1 that it gives is no joke whatsoever. In Blitz, your opponent normally wants to get down to as low life threshold as possible so that they can have one more big turn, and if that big turn doesn't win them the game, it ends up just them kind of like blocking out and hoping that you will miss Blood Debt and kill yourself. But Convulsions is going to protect you from that. It's giving you that keyword Dominate, which is fantastic. And even late game, it's a little clunky, but off 2 cards once again, you could do Convulsions with the blue to come in with Ghostly from the Banish Zone for 5 Dominate, which isn't great, but in those late game situations, it's still something threatening. So you can block with this card, it does block 3, but you want at least 1 in your deck for that second cycle, I'd say. And then of course we got Reckless Swing, which is just another fantastic blue for the deck. If you see it early game, great, fills the grave. It's that beautiful 4-block, deals a little bit of damage to them. If you see it late game, it probably wins you the game, and the threat of it alone is going to make your opponent play super weird into you sometimes, which is fantastic. If you see it mid game, it's really not that big a problem because of what this deck's trying to do anyway, which is like keep a blue to still play the game. So really it's just not that much of an awkward card, and if you have 2 in your hand, yeah, that's a problem, but hopefully you can sink it away and it won't be such a big deal. And then we've got Blue Wrecker Romp, which is just one of the most fantastic like vanilla type cards we have in the deck. It is a blue 6 3-block. What else can you want? It's actually even playable early game in this deck just to fill grave an extra bit, which is fantastic. It just does everything the deck wants to do. So always going to run the 2 copies there. And then we have the 3 blue 1-ofs here. I have Ophidia, fantastic in Levia. I've been a big fan of it for a long while now, and in Blitz it is just so good to have that extra opt effect in, because you can bottom, when you peep the top, you can either dig further into the Bloodrush Bellows turns, or if you see some powerful reds, you know you can bottom them to have a more powerful second cycle than your opponent probably will, because they don't have opt effects like you do. The other beautiful thing is how it works with Art of War, which is that when you pitch it to Art of War, you can actually choose to, or sorry, you can opt to before you choose to with Art of War, which is amazing, because in this deck, since you don't have the Graveling Growl, you need to be very careful about choosing Go Again or the +1 effect. Obviously, if you have the Ghostly Visit banished, you probably always go Again. But if you don't and have it with Eye of Ophidia, you can look at the top and have full information about whether or not you should pick +1 or Go Again. So that's just fantastic. Then we've got Soul Harvest, which is just another 3-block, 6-attack blue. You probably never play it in this build because this build is not that Blood Debt heavy. In fact, one of the things to note about the Blood Debt in this build, when we get to Doomsday here, is that this deck, if you look at the Blood Debt count, is really not that high. This isn't a deck that's looking to build up, 10 Blood Debt and just be living on a knife's edge and, has the potential to just kill themselves if you miss Blood Debt. This deck's going to build up maybe like 2 or 3 Blood Debt in the middle game, maybe 0 early game, because you've got all these things that don't have Blood Debt. You've got all these things that you're filling Graveyard with that aren't even 6 powers, because the only things that really gain a benefit for banishing the 6 would be like the Endless Mob and the Dread Screamer. And those are going to play more controlled in that mid game. But early game, if you're just playing a Boneyard, playing a Hungering, Deadwood, you don't even care what you banish. So the Blood Debt is really not that big an issue in this deck. But you will hit, the ratios are such that you will hit that magic number of 6 by second cycle. It's pretty much where your Blood Debt sits at, is about 5, 6, 7, that kind of range. And of course you can control it a bit with Carrion Husk. So Doomsday is always playable in this build, which I absolutely love. But it is a second cycle card. So you are going to want to put it at the bottom, either through pitching, the Sink Blows, whatever. But it is definitely one of the best cards late game possible. When you have your opponent on this back foot where they are forced to block out with their hand, and then all of a sudden you just spawn a Blasmafet, and then when they block out with their hand and have no turn back into you, you just get free value Blasmafet on board. It's just insane. And of course it makes your Scab Skins just do nuts things. So if you can save your Gambler's Glove up until that late game when you've summoned Doomsday, fantastic. You'll probably win every game. Yeah, so that's the main deck here. Last thing to say about the whole build is that it's very tricky. It doesn't play the way that a lot of other Levia decks probably have. If you've been looking at how I like to play Levia, it's more, stall and then put on the gas, aggressive. This one's very different. It's very much a deck that is actively playing the game very aggressively from the beginning with these 2-card hand threats that you're trying to assemble. And just to explain that a bit further, right, is that 2-card hand threats are something that is very unique to this deck with the numbers, like I mentioned earlier. So when your opponent is playing off 2 cards, they're just not doing the same amount of damage as you. But that's kind of the game state you want to get them to in this deck, is when you swing for 9, you want them to block with 2, take 3. You've won that trade. You've chipped damage. And then they play their turn off 2. And then you block with 2 cards and kind of get into that same rhythm, but then you have the explosion that's Bloodrush Bellows in your deck to just know that you've got crazy turns coming up. And then you have the potentially infinite value of Scabskin Leathers. So this deck is very different in how it plays. A little bit complicated, I'll say, as well, because in Blitz, you dance this fine line of just like misplaying 1 turn probably loses you the game. So, you will need reps. You will need to practice this quite a bit. I do have an armory coming up tomorrow, so I'll leave a comment probably saying how that went. But in online testing, this has been doing fantastically. It's a blast to play, and it just does things that no other deck is doing in Blitz. It's really fun in that regard, and it's really going to catch people by surprise. So hopefully this video wasn't too late to get it out there for Skirmish season. I implore you all to give it a go. It is lots of fun. And then a couple last things to wrap up with. Before people ask in the comments why I'm not running XYZ, something like Command and Conquer doesn't fit what this build is trying to do. It wants numbers to matter more than hit effects when it plays off 2-card hands. And Command and Conquer is a 2-card hand that's just a hit effect, not a big number. So we want cards that, when I swing for 9, if you decide not to block, I want that damage to be insane. So Command and Conquer doesn't exactly fit that. Plus, of course, it doesn't turn off Blood Debt, which in Blitz, you need to be very, very careful about. So it just, unfortunately, doesn't make the cut. But, I could see it making its way back in. But it's just, at this point, I'm not entirely sure what it would replace. I really love every card in the deck. Already talked about why Graveling Growl isn't in here. And then we've got something like Writhing Beast Hulk over Hungering Slaughterbeast. Honestly, that one's up to you. Hungering Slaughterbeast, just presenting that 1 higher damage, fits into what I just said about Command and Conquer. You want the raw damage to matter. So, the Dominate's cool and all, but you have that to win the game with Convulsion, so I just don't think you need it. And then Howl from Beyond. And honestly, Howl from Beyond, if you're not loving all of the defense reactions, you could probably cut like one of the Fate for Scenes for the Howl, just to have that extra recursion in there. But you don't need it, because in Blitz, the damage you need to deal is just not the same as it is in CC to win the game. And you're going to be hitting those damage points with everything else your deck's doing anyway, with like the Blood Rush, cheesing games off the Convulsions or Reckless Swing, so you just don't need it. And then, of course, because you can't sideboard, there are some matchups where it's just a huge liability to have a 2-block in your deck. So yeah, that's the deck, y'all. Wanted to also say that we did hit 500 subscribers so quickly. So honestly, thank you. Last video popped off, and you all are awesome for leaving me likes and subscriptions. I am waiting to announce the winner until the Communities tab feature is unlocked, which should probably be another couple days now. So be looking for that. But really, once again, thank you so much for being a part of my channel, and hope this build brings you some fun. This is Manset. Have a good one.